Welcome everybody. So thank you very much for joining our practical SME webinar series. Today we're focusing on procurement and we're focusing on the public sector. So trying to make sure that SMEs have access to that market. So we're talking about potentially doubling your market and how to get your first public procurement contract. I am delighted that I have Bellis with me today. He is Senior Policy Advisor at the FSB, not the Russian one, but the Federation of Small Businesses. And welcome, Dan. How are you?
Hi, Nikki. Thanks for having me. I'm great, thanks.
Excellent. So he's really on knows what's happening in the SME space for making sure that the different public sector organizations do use SMEs as much as possible in contracts. So really good. We're going to find out lots and lots. So try, if you can hang on for the bulk of everything is in the first 45 minutes, then we've got lots of questions and answers. So please do try and stay as long as you can. If not, don't worry, don't panic. We are recording as always, and so you can watch later. And then of course, we have the extra long-haired Pete today, Pete Ames.
Yes. Hello, Nikki. Hello, everybody. I have gone full hippie. I apologise. Such a business-orientated meeting, and look at me. So I am here to support the webinar. I'm not necessarily a contributor, though I run my own small business, so I'll probably be throwing in some of my own questions. Couple of housekeeping points. Number one, as Nikki said, there's a recording. It's going to be made available to everybody after the fact. So if you drop out, don't worry, it'll be there. And if you find it really useful and you want to send it on to somebody, it will be available within sort of the next 48 hours or so. Number two, as Nikki said, it's a Q&A led webinar. We're going to stop for Q&A about midway through, and then we're going to have a follow-on Q&A at the very end of the webinar. Ask whatever questions you wish. But to do so, please use the chat function. So if you wiggle your mouse, you should find the chat button at the bottom, and it'll open up on the side. The reason we use the chat is because it defaults to only being visible to myself, Nikki, and Dan, which means you can ask questions very openly that perhaps you wouldn't want to ask if your name were associated with them. I won't drop anyone's name when I ask the question during the Q&A. Except for Nigel. He has it coming. He's already said hello to everyone, so that's fine.
He was super early bird. He's always early for meetings.
He is. I love him for it.
Being late, though. He must have been surprised that I was actually online on time. But anyway.
Right. So just to let us check that we have all found the chat, I just want to get us, get those fingers moving. I'm going to ask a quick question. Yes, no. Please just pop your answer in the chat. Have you made any attempt to win public sector work? Yes or no? Pop the answers in the chat. Now give us an idea. We've got a yes from Nikki. Got a no from me, actually. I've not tried before. And while you're in the chat as well, I would also ask, what would you like to get from today's session? You've come along, you've put the time aside. What are you hoping to learn? And we can make sure that between the three of us, you learn it. So while your answers are coming into those questions, Nikki, back to you. Do you want to cover off what we're doing today?
Absolutely. So it's jam-packed today. We're covering 4 main areas. So the 4 areas are where to start looking for ideal tenders. Then we're also going to go through how to choose the first tender you go for. Next is how do you approach your first tender? The next one, this will be the fun one, as much as you can get fun in public sector, some common mistakes to avoid. So some little anecdotes and things of what to avoid of things that have gone wrong. So what we're going to talk about, because he's Dan, because he's the best person to talk to on the subject. So it's because this is what he does all the time. 100% of the time he's working for the FSB, lobbying on behalf of SMEs to get access in the public sector to get us contracts, looking at the different methods that the different organizations are using, contributing to white papers, etc. So yeah, Dan, just tell me a little bit more on what is your role. Obviously I can say absolutely lots of lovely things, but let's hear from the horse's mouth. Talk about a bit more, so what the FSB is and how you fit in.
Sure. So I'm Dan Bellis, Senior Policy Manager for the Federation of Small Businesses. For those of you that haven't heard of, as Nikki said at the start, we're not from the Russian Secret Intelligence Agency. We are a membership organisation, 160-ish thousand strong, made up of all sorts of small businesses from a range of different sectors. And my job and the job of the team in Westminster is to talk to our members, find out what the small business community want and what can make life a bit easier and a bit better for you guys, and then try and relay that to politicians and civil servants to try and make that happen. And one of my roles for FSB is to do that in relation to public procurement. So we understand, we talk to members, we find out what the frustrations are with the current public procurement system. We then we then come up with reasonable solutions, ways that government can make things better. And then we work incredibly closely with government, both at a national and a local level as well, to change the rules, change the legislation that determines the hoops we have to jump through to secure some of these contracts. But then we'll also work directly with government bodies and with government agencies to try and create things like framework agreements that really work for small businesses as well. So whilst we're not involved in every single procurement decision that government makes, or every single framework that they publish, because as I'm sure you can appreciate, we would need a much bigger team to be able to do that. There have been cases where we've worked incredibly closely to design opportunities so that they attract SMEs and really work for SMEs as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, and if anyone hasn't come across the FSB, I don't know where you've been, because it's a fabulous organisation. So just, if you're not already a member, do look it up, because it has loads of great benefits. I'm obviously slightly biased because I used to be the chair for the Thames Valley, but it's great organisation. So Pete, what's been coming through? What have people said?
Well, I think there's two things in terms of who's got experience and who hasn't. The majority, I'd say comfortably 80, maybe even 90% haven't even tried to go for public procurement. So we've got a virgin territory for you, Dan. And then in terms of what people are hoping to get from today, a few variations roughly around the theme of, what do I do to get started? What is it that's the common blocker? What are these things how can I target local authorities? Those kind of questions. So I think very practical is what we're looking for today.
Absolutely. We always like to be practical. Absolutely. Want this to be as useful as possible for everybody. So let's dive straight in then. So Dan, and it looks like there's, quite a lot of newbies to public sector. There's a few that have got experience online, but this first one's absolutely relevant for if they've never done this before. So lots of SMEs they haven't tried it because they just don't know where to start. So where is the best place to start?
So I think the first thing that we have to do is understand what public procurement actually is. It's very easy to think of, I'm dealing directly with government or directly with a local authority. And whilst that is true, you can go for contracts with the Ministry of Justice and your local authority with relative ease. Contracts with your local sports centre or providing a new boiler to a local school as well. They're all public procurement opportunities. And those are direct, they're also indirect opportunities as well. So although you may not be contracting directly with a local authority or with the government department, you may still be involved in a public sector supply chain. And the opportunities and where you find these opportunities should be in exactly the same place. And that's going to be a key word throughout this little section is should, because whilst things should happen, it's not always the case that they go down this way. So all public sector contracts and all subcontracting opportunities should be published on Contracts Finder, which is a central government website. A lot of central government departments use this. It's less so for local authorities, and it's even less so for subcontracting opportunities, but they should all be on there. And we at FSB encourage government departments and those big tier 1 providers in public sector supply chain to publish as many opportunities in that area as they can. Now, if you Google public sector contracts, I would like to think that Contracts Finder comes up fairly quickly. In reality, there's probably about a page and a half worth of adverts to try and work your way through. So if you're looking for it, don't Google public sector contracts, Google Contracts Finder, and make sure you go through to the gov.uk version of that website. It's fairly easy to find. It looks like almost every other government website, and I can't necessarily say that it's as shiny as some others. It's not the greatest to deal with. But there are a lot of paid for adverts out there as well. And when you're looking for contracting opportunities, whether it's directly in the public sector or whether it's as a supply chain opportunity, never ever pay to get access to those websites and to be able to see those opportunities. And if you come across those types of practices as well, where people are claiming that they have exclusive access to these contracts, but they're behind a paywall, there is the Public Procurement Review Service as well, where you can report this, because it's against all of the rules in the book. These contracts are free to access. They are free to look at should you wish to go ahead and go through that process. So the first rule of today is don't ever, ever, ever pay to see an opportunity.
And Peter's very helpfully put the link to Contracts Finder in the chat. So thank you, Pete.
Here to help.
Copy that, save that. Make sure you only go to that one. Don't go to these paid links, because I almost myself got succumbed to one of those once when we were looking at some, and they do a good sales patter about it. So it's easy to get your checkbook out, but don't.
Exactly. So make sure you're using the free option first of all. Now, while they should be on Contracts Finder, most small businesses, especially those dipping their toe into public procurement for the first time, are likely going to want to deal with their local authority primarily. Always good to keep things local, seen as a little bit easier to deal with, and a little bit easier to get to the right person on the phone should you have to do that. Local authorities, however, are less likely to use Contracts Finder for their procurement opportunities and more likely to use their own local portals. So you might Google the name of your local authority and put in public procurement opportunities as well down the side of it. And you might find that they have a shared combined resource with a few other local authorities, in which case, great, because there's more contracting opportunities there for you to look at. But otherwise, it's a case of finding that own local portal as well. And just to make sure that we're talking the same space here, local authorities aren't bound to put every single opportunity to that. Depending on the level of opportunity, that they can use things like invitation to tenders and standing orders as well. So this is more about finding those published opportunities and where they should be available. So Contracts Finder and local authority portals are the two main ones that I would look for.
Absolutely. So just one thing with the local authorities. Now, all the local authorities are set up often slightly differently, but some of them do have local economic officers or something. They may be called a different thing or something, or it might be under the LEP as well. If they do have them, go and ask these people as well, because they might be helpful on where the places are best to find the right contracts and the timings and things as well. Would you concur?
Yeah, that can definitely be helpful, but they should all be available on sort of one website, as it were, but run by the local authority somewhere. So yeah, if you have to sort of advance notice of when these opportunities might be coming out, that's definitely a bonus. All of these websites will offer the ability to give us your email address, tick which boxes you're interested in, and we'll let you know when they pop up. But yeah, if you can get somebody on the end of the phone from the local authority to say, I'm after more information with regards to this contract or this framework agreement, then that's always a good way of doing things. And plus, it's always easy to speak to a human being than try and navigate your way through some quite clunky portals. The other side that I was going to very quickly touch on is subcontracting opportunities. So this is where you're not dealing with a local authority direct, or you're not dealing with central government direct, but it is a public sector supply chain. They should be on things like Contracts Finder, but there are big national infrastructure projects such as High Speed 2, for example, that again use their own portals as well to showcase their own opportunities within that supply chain. But again, please never pay to see these opportunities.
Okay, so that is definitely a clear message. Go to the horse's mouth for these opportunities. Go to Contracts Finder or the local authorities portals, and do not pay, because of course we don't like paying anything that we don't have to, do we, Pete?
We don't. No, we're very tight.
So Pete, so you just going to do a quick reminder?
I am, yes. I'm just going to let everybody know, if you've got questions as Dan's going through his points, please do pop them in the chat. Get them out of your head, pop them in the chat. I'll put them aside and we'll come to them when Q&A happens. If he answers them as we go, don't worry, I'll pluck that out and I'll check it with you. So please as questions occur, drop them in the chat. Don't hold on to them. And actually, just picking up on this a little bit, Dan, I think there was, when we did the rehearsal, you mentioned that one of the big confusion points for people when they first start, number one, where to find them. The other thing I think you mentioned was the different types, which I didn't know that there's a difference from getting onto a framework to getting onto the equivalent of a PSL, all these sorts of things. Do you want to just talk briefly about that? Because some are easier than others for people to approach first time, aren't they?
Sure. It can be a very confusing landscape, and occasionally you might see a contract on Contracts Finder for something like £2 billion, but actually the reality of the work
Let's
that
get
you're
it
going to
now.
be awarded from there is probably more like 20,000, which is quite a difference. So it's important to understand what you're actually bidding for, whether it's a framework, a dynamic purchasing system, or it is on occasion a direct contract to do a set service. So a direct contract is pretty much what it says on the tin. It's no different from doing a business-to-business contract where you say you will supply me with X in so many days, for example, or a service, for example. That's very much we're purchasing this as a one-off. It might roll over forward, but for now it's a one-time purchase sort of thing. The other type are framework agreements, which is the easiest way to think of a framework agreement is it's like getting listed in the catalogue. Ultimately, somebody has to sell local government paper clips, and if you're selling thousands and thousands and thousands of paper clips to local governments, it's probably easier to agree a set standard terms and conditions of what you're going to charge per paperclip and how you're going to deliver them. So a framework agreement is basically, it opens up, you can bid to go into the framework for stationery, say, to give an example. You will share all of this information, so it'll be things like insurance requirements for paperclips, hypothetically, turnover levels, staffing levels, all these things, but also how many paperclips you can produce and in what time. You go into this framework, you are approved because you meet all these basic criteria, and then you stay on the framework for the life of that framework opportunities. And whenever anybody who is signed up to this framework across the government, so it could be local authorities, it could be all government departments, they'll all use the same catalogue, and they say, right, we want to buy paperclips. They will look into this hypothetical catalogue, see that you're there, see the price you charge per paperclip, and place an order through you. So think of it as a little bit like a government-based Amazon website that you're sort of signed up to.
Yeah, so you've got the
catalogue.
Yeah, you've got the right. You've got the right to sell to the government at this point, but there's no guarantee that the government will pick your paperclips. If somebody else has got shinier, brassier paperclips in the catalogue for the same price and the same service, they're going to end up going that way. Yeah,
but what tends to happen is that if you get onto a framework agreement, whilst there is no guarantee of work coming that way, eventually 9 times out of 10 something does come through, because the frameworks have budgets attached to them. Mm-hmm. And they need to spend that money that's attached to that framework contract as well. So over the life of that framework, that will come forward. So whilst it might not be instant, it is always good to be on them. The problem we find though with framework agreements is that they tend to then close, and they can be closed for up to 7 years, sometimes longer, which isn't necessarily within the regulations, but it is within public practice, let's say. Which is why we push for dynamic purchasing systems, which are very similar to frameworks, except that rather than being closed for a couple of years, they're open for the entire time. It's a much more basic set of criteria that you have to meet. And if you can meet that basic set of criteria, there's no reason whatsoever that they can exclude you from that list. So you can get yourself on there. Yes, there might be a bit more competition on these things, but you can go on and you can come off at any point. If you're selling paperclips, you are not going to be restricted to a 18-month window to get yourself on this framework. You can do it at any point over the next 10 years of the life of that dynamic purchasing system. So it's important to understand what it is that you're trying to get yourself on.
Excellent. So we know where we can go for the contracts, potentially different types of ones that there are, the frameworks or the catalogue equivalent that we can get onto. But how, time's precious for an SME. You haven't got time necessarily, because you'd be surprised how many potential contracts there are available. It's not time to apply for everything, or if you do, you won't be getting any billable work done. So what how should you set about approaching what one to select, and which is the best sorts of ones to go for at the beginning?
I think that's a really good question. I think my advice to most small businesses would be, do not take a scattergun approach to this. Have a look at a lot of different contracting opportunities, but then whittle it down to only a few. The fewer the better, really, and really concentrate on them. We've seen it before where small businesses have shared their stories with us at FSB, and you find out that they applied something like 50 different opportunities in the space of a month, which is quite scary, the amount of time that they put into those. But you can also then begin to question the quality of those bids and those responses going in. I think the other side of the coin is make sure that it works for your business. So again, if this is your first venture into the public landscape, don't try and make your business fit into a certain framework or fit into a particular opportunity. There is always going to be an element of that, and we'll come on to that when we talk about sort of speaking the government language or so. But don't try and do something that you're not overly comfortable with, especially for the first time, because you don't want to put yourself or your businesses in those difficult situations when you're going forward and you're having to adapt things on the fly a little bit.
Is there like a, I mean, I don't know, I haven't asked this before, so I really generally don't know the answer. If you did a really terrible bid and did a complete faux pas, is there like a blacklist that actually there's, then there'd be no point applying ever again?
No,
or is it are you starting from a blank slate each time?
We would if we found a blank list as such, we would be coming down quite heavy on that and wanting to remove that as quickly as possible. One of the things that we're big advocates for, and we're pushing for this in the white paper, is the mandatory inclusion of feedback letters. So I don't care how bad your bid is, you should always receive feedback on why it wasn't accepted. Even if it is stating the damn obvious sometimes, those feedback letters are really valuable. And even if you can just say, like, here are 3 things that didn't work this time around, even if it was mostly price-based, that's fine, because it gives the small businesses an opportunity to improve for next time. And it gives them information that, yeah, it can perhaps help them in their private sector work as well. What we don't like to see is cases where small businesses have spent hours, days, weeks putting together these carefully crafted bids just to get rejected, and they've got no idea why. You have a right to feedback coming back from there. I would definitely encourage businesses to chase up those opportunities, because from our own data, it's at best 50-50 for your first contracting opportunity. If you're trying to do this yourself, use that feedback as a positive. Use it to inform your bids for the future. Use it to inform the work that you're doing in the private sector as well.
And so how would you filter down those bids? Is there, if there's 100, is there easy filtering on there, or do you like literally have to read through everything?
It's difficult. I would simply say that this is a government website that is designed to hold thousands of bids. So yes, while there are filters in there, the filters are only good as the people actually putting the bids on the website in the first place. So by all means, do use the filters to try and narrow down your options. Keyword searching as well is always quite useful. You kind of know some of the keywords that your products are listed, or your services are listed against, from your work in the private sector. So there is that opportunity to use that there, but the websites are sometimes a little bit clunky. So it will require a little bit of time going through various lists and checking the details on them as well. But all the information should be within each individual bid to allow you to read through a couple of documents and get a good feel of whether or not this is worth investing a bit more time in.
And do you have to be a certain size? So, you talked earlier about £2 billion contracts. Is there like a sensible metric of, if you're a certain size company, then it makes sense that you should be bidding for this certain size contracts? Is there something, or is it,
yes,
no, you've got the best contract, the best product, let's apply for, the big ones? What would you suggest?
It's a little bit yes and no on this. So there are definitely government contracts where the government will turn around and say, look, this is a £2 million contract, and your yearly turnover last year was 1.2 million. So we're making up an awful lot of your work, if not more, than what you were able to deliver last year. We're not sure you can meet this contract going forward. So there is a little bit of that in some stages, especially for more routine services or construction, for example, which is always a very nervous area for government when it comes to turnover requirements as well, because the last thing they want to do is get halfway through a project and a business goes bust. And that's not reserved to SMEs either. There have been some very high profile big construction companies where effectively they were using government works to provide them with capital that they were then using to fund other projects, and then not being able to deliver on the public sector ones.
Indeed.
And they're worried across the board. So yes, there will be big contracting opportunities where they're very nervous about things like turnover. Equally, there are some really interesting areas. So for example, I know the MOD have a DSTL framework agreements and contracting opportunities where you can be a small business, you can have a relatively low turnover, but if your product's really interesting and really innovative, then they will take a long, hard look at that. And regardless of sort of the prices that they're attaching to some of these R&D side of things, if the product's good enough, then yes, you can. So it depends on the sector a little bit with that one.
Indeed. And so I know that we mentioned, we were chatting last week about when you're putting it together, about whether you should actually engage a consultant for this kind of thing. So we have been very clear, don't pay to get access to the contracts, but is there, does it make sense to get a specialist in?
I'd say it depends how brave you are. I wouldn't say to any SME who has been operating in the private sector for a few years to scrap 2023, your business plan, and pivot it entirely to public sector contracts. That would be an incredible move if you did that, and the best of luck to you. But it's probably not the most sensible to completely about turn. So dip your toe in this water first, and do give it a go, and hopefully it's, the work that we've been able to do on some of these framework agreements encourages you to go for more. But if you are dipping your toe in the water and you kind of need a win, or you're looking at this to try and just tip the balance of what could be a difficult year next year to a good year, then yeah, it might be well worth employing a consultant to sort of come along and help you with that language of government as well, because it can be a bit impenetrable at times. It is something that we're trying to fix. But there's definite benefits to having a professional take you through this. Equally, if this is a nice to do, I'll give it a go. If it doesn't work out, no harm, no foul, then okay, fine, do try it yourself. You're probably more likely to fall in some of those common pit holes, but there's no harm at that place, in that place, and it can be a valuable learning tool that will both benefit you in future bidding opportunities and in the private sector.
Yeah, and you really should always look at the opportunity cost. If you're spending time working on that bid versus paying for a consultant, it could be cheaper for you to pay for a consultant if you could have been earning money elsewhere anyway. So do think about
Always that
sensible little
cost
things
benefit
like that.
analysis.
Yeah. So Pete, I see that the chat is getting really busy, so it's probably a good time to do a bit of a Q&A.
I think it's a perfect time to do a Q&A. In fact, I will say this now, I can almost guarantee I won't have time in this Q&A section to get through every question, which I apologize in advance for. I will try and make sure that everybody gets at least one of their questions answered. Anything we don't cover now, we are going to cover at the end. Dan has agreed to spend time past the end of the webinar, extra 15 minutes, to make sure every question is answered. So if you can, hang around. If you can't, or you have to get off at the very end of the webinar, let me know when you ask a question. I'll try and balance things around to make sure that I ask your questions
And there
first.
is the recording. So
and there's going to be the recording for you to check it out then. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go with the last question I was asked, actually, because it's just in front of me. I thought it was a great question. How are SMEs expected to write as good a bid response compared to large organizations that perhaps have professional bid writers and bid teams? is it a huge gulf, or is it just an apparent one? And actually, what matters is the underlying thing.
Yeah, so I would say that there is a gap. These large businesses have entire teams dedicated to watching these contracts, to writing these professional bids. And this kind of comes back to what we were talking about with regards to those turnover requirements again. The difference, I would say, though, is that these incredibly large businesses who have professional writing teams more likely to be going for your big contracts with major government departments that SMEs just aren't quite competing for yet. And we're talking tens of millions, well, easily more in some cases there. So if you're an SME going for that size of contract, you're going to need the resources behind you to try and bid for that. What we're encouraging government to do is, instead of having these massive contracts that realistically only the large providers can go for, we're trying to get them to chop them up into much smaller units. Because often what actually happens is that the large business comes in there with their fantastic bid and everything else, they win the contract, and then they just chop it up anyway and give it out to SMEs further down the supply chain. That tends to be what's happened. So we're encouraging government to try and introduce more smaller lots that are a bit more digestible for SMEs to bid for. But yeah, if you're going for the, I mean, in some cases, £1 billion contracting opportunities, then you're going to need an incredible team behind you to try and steal that one from under the nose. But we are doing our best to try and level that playing field.
Okay, so I think that's a good answer. So essentially, yes, you're facing the big boys, but if you're taking your advice from earlier and starting with small local authority, getting used to the process, you'll find that they're not there to compete with in the first place. Okay, fantastic.
I think in terms of levels as well, most SMEs bid for a contract under £100,000.
Yeah.
If you have a professional bid writing team of 15 people, you're wasting your time going for those contracts. You're not going to be in that market.
Yeah, that's very true. Very true. And that actually does bring up a question that someone did ask is, what are the minimum sized contracts advertised? Is it 100K plus, or is it less?
We would definitely say less than 100K.
Yeah.
Local authorities have things like standing orders where they say anything below £50,000, they can just go out for 3 quotes or 3 tenders, which are invitation only, which is something we're trying to encourage local authorities to get away from. And that way it never ends up on contracts finder, which is a bit frustrating. And it does come down to that old school phrase of who you know, not necessarily what you know.
Yeah.
But we are encouraging local authorities, and in some cases this is really working as well, to introduce contracts around the £10,000 mark, as low as that. So much more manageable. It's not going to change the world overnight, but it's those sort of entry points into the system that we're encouraging local authorities to have, rather than, I mean, we've talked to some government departments that insist that a contract value of £250,000 is low and manageable for first-time SMEs, and we politely point out that that's not always the case. You need to go much lower to offer some of those opportunities, and it's about getting that entry point, really. So no, we would always encourage local authorities and contracting authorities to go well under £100,000.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Dan. We've got a few questions around what it takes to win, and I'm going to wait on that because I know you've got some great tips. So those questions, if you've asked a question around what it takes to be a winner, what gives you a better chance, I'm going to sit on those till the end because Dan may well answer them as we go. Instead, I'm going to ask, pardon me, a few questions around how do you search, how do you hone in on a concise sector? As you said, sometimes the language can be a little esoteric and hard to navigate through. And do you only really have a choice of play with the filters and ultimately wade through a couple of thousand opportunities, or are there some tips and tricks for people?
So what I would say is that when you're going to the Contracts Finder website, especially, is you can filter by document type. So there are active contracts on there. There are award notices where they say, this is the person who won that contract and these are the bid details of, so you can see how they did it almost. Okay. There are early notifications, which is basically saying, these are the early details of the contract that's becoming available. This is when it's going to become available, but it's not live yet. Start doing your homework. So I would take the view of, okay, when am I realistically going to be looking to put one of these bids together? Is it tomorrow? In which case I want to be looking at bids that are actively inviting tenders, or is it in a couple of months' time? In which case, I want to be looking at those early invitation notices to kind of say, okay, that's one that I can start doing my homework on now. I've got 6 weeks or so to get a few things in order before the opportunity to bid goes live. So if you simply put a stopwatch on when you're looking to do this, that almost cuts your workload down by a third straight away, just by making sure that you're not wasting your time looking at award notices where
you're not ready to
done.
move for. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So hopefully that answers the question for the person asked it. If it didn't, please do let me know in the chat. Let me have a quick look. There was another one. Someone did ask, do you have to pay to get on a framework? So you don't pay to access the opportunity, but if you win the framework, is there circumstances where you need to put some money down on the table?
No, you will normally have to show that you've got a certain level of turnover, for example, and a certain level of insurance grants, but you shouldn't pay to then be on there. There's
So
a lot
no
of things.
requirement for brown envelopes. That's not required.
That's concerning. If you are in a public sector contract and you have been asked for a brown envelope, please do report it to the Public Procurement Review Service. It's completely anonymous. We as FSB have spoken to members and taken their case through that service for a sort of positive result at the end of it. But these are exactly the types of behaviours that we're trying to stamp out with the government. So please do let us know if you're ever asked to do that.
Wonderful. I don't even have any brown envelopes, so I'm clearly out.
No, I was just thinking some of the younger people watching may not even realise envelope. What's an envelope?
Backhander. So I think the other questions we've got left are, I think, going to come in naturally from what you're about to talk about, and if not, we're going to pick them up in the Q&A at the end.
So we'll make sure we leave plenty of time at the end.
Last thing I just wanted to say, though, we did have something from Gareth. Thank you for this, Gareth. You put it in the chat saying bidder days are worth keeping an eye out if you're new to the world. Networking opportunities, and you get an understanding, as you said, sort of what's coming down the track before it's perhaps even officially out there. Do you want to just talk about that a little bit, Dan? And then we'll move on.
Yeah, sure. So we host Meet the Buyer events, bidder days. You can call them what you want. They're effectively you turn up in a room with the NHS. In our case, we did a few of those. You will have the people making the purchasing decisions, or the people who designed the framework from the NHS or whatever body is hosting this particular bidder days. You'll be able to ask them questions about how it works, what the payment terms are like, insurance requirements, all this and all that. But you'll also have an opportunity to kind of showcase your business as well, so that you can have that early engagement face to face with them. Obviously, over the last couple of years, these bidder days have been fewer between. It's quite difficult sometimes over the last couple of years to get everybody all in one room to showcase your talents. But hopefully they will make a return. The FSB regularly in our regions works with different providers to host these bidder days as well, and to try and put them forward to our members. But we only ever try to work with bodies, both public and private sector, that have sort of that reputable standard, so that if it's coming from FSB, we check things like the payment terms within those contracts as well, to make sure that businesses aren't signing up to 300 days payment terms when they get involved with these things. So yes, they're a great way to do work. Do look out for them. Hopefully they make more of a return soon.
Excellent. No, they sound great events.
They do indeed. Thank you very much, Gareth, for bringing it up. Right, Nikki, should we move on?
Super. Okay, so third section. So you found one that you like, found a bid, a contract, a framework, one that you think, oh yes, I could easily do that. My company can, we'll be perfect for it. What's the best way to approach it to maximize their chance of success?
So I'd say the first thing to do, and it kind of comes back to that stopwatch we talked about earlier, how quickly are you looking to bid for these contracts? But I'd say the first thing to do, if you've got the time, is to get your paperwork in order. So this is making sure that you have the required standards, which are normally published on the bidding documents, or on the early invitation documents as well. And that might be cybersecurity plus, for example, it might be ISO 4001 or something like that. But make sure you've got those standards there. You'll also like to be asked for things like your public indemnity insurance, for example, if it's that type of contract where you're dealing with members of the public. Your turnover requirements as well. We've even seen cases, which is rare, where you ask for accounts. We have a bit of a pushback against that sometimes, but there are a lot of checks and balances that government will want to do against your business to make sure that they know who they're dealing with. There have been cases as well where businesses have been asked for credit scores, or the government has basically gone and found a credit score for that business through Dun & Bradstreet or something like that as well. And if you ever come across difficulties in these areas, we are all ears. We do at FSB like to regularly talk to our members and small businesses to find out what these problems are. Because if there are too onerous requirements placed on businesses to bid for some of these things, then we can work with central government to try and help change that as well. But ultimately, there will be a bit of paperwork to shift through and to make sure you've got in line. The last thing you want to be doing is rushing around a week before the deadline trying to find out where on earth that insurance certificate has gone. So it's just making sure that paperwork's there and in order, really. I'd probably say, sorry, go on.
Sorry, Dan, I was going to say, somebody did ask a question. Now is probably the perfect time to bring it in. So they asked, do you need documents, ISOs and so on? Sounds like yes, quite frequently you do. I'm presuming for some, they will be specific to the type of work you're tendering for. There are ISOs related to print. They're only going to apply to print. Are there a common set of these required standards, so on, that everybody should just have if they're thinking of going for this?
Oh, now you're really testing my ISO knowledge here.
I am.
Basic health and safety is a normal standard procedure. I think that always gets checked. I know that there's a requirement said that you don't have to have a formal health and safety action plan if you have, I think, fewer than 2 employees off the top of my head. But if you're bidding the local authority contracts, you are almost always going to be asked for that plan. So you may as well have it in place anyway. 5, thank you, Nikki.
I think so.
So there's a few basic things like that, that if you're a relatively new SME or few employees, that you currently don't need to do. But if you're going into that public sector space, then you're going to be asked for them anyway, and some of them are good practice. So it is quite useful to have those things in place. I see someone's just mentioned in the chat, Cyber Essentials Plus, Cyber Essentials. That is becoming more commonplace. It is something that we're looking to encourage our members to do going forward as computers become ever more akin to our day-to-day life, especially in a world of virtual networking that we're currently in now as well. That becomes more commonplace, but again, if you're involved in road repair, for example, you're less likely to need something like Cyber Essentials. But in a lot of businesses, even just a case of email data handling, there's an awful lot of data encoded within emails. Simply making sure that you've got the ability to send and receive emails safely is quite important. So there are a few things that you can look at that are relatively low barrier as well.
And those things also are quite relevant if you're applying for big contracts in the private sector as well. So if you're applying for publicly listed companies and things, you know, the larger businesses, they expect all their suppliers to have things like that. So it's not a waste. You're not just doing it for your public sector work. Often you probably do need it on your private side as well.
And it's worth, I'll just do a cheeky little a pitch for those that have not come across it before. On Nikki's, on the Gorringe YouTube channel, we did a webinar on legal documents, didn't we?
We did.
We did. So go and check that out if you want to think more about that.
Colleague Diane.
There we go. Oh, it's all coming together. What a beautiful circle.
It's all family.
So I think, Dan, sorry, I've interrupted the flow a little bit there.
Missed flow. So probably next to go to, let's go. We haven't been through the scoring mechanism, have we? So
once you've got all your legal documents together, the best way to then think about how your bid is going to be interpreted is scores, basically. So I'm going to keep the numbers incredibly simple here, just because it's nearly 2 o'clock on a Wednesday. No one wants a maths lesson.
Yeah.
So the basic way, the basic way to think about this is that your bid process might be split up into 4 sections. Section 1 might be, do you have your legal documents in place? tick, 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 tick. You've got them all in. Congratulations, you get full marks for that section. Section 2 might be, do you have a history of delivering this product? Tick, 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 100%. Yeah, you've scored all the points available in that section. There will then be a section on social value as well, which I'll come on to in a second, because that can be incredibly important. And then there may be a section on price as well. And what you tend to find is that, especially in really competitive bids, and this is where the big bid teams kind of flex their muscles, I guess, but again, different markets, is that if you've got 4 categories, 9 times out of 10, 3 of those categories, everybody will score 100%, which basically means that the only category that really differentiates your bid from anyone else is the price level. We're trying to get away from this, because even though price might only make up 10% of the overall scoring system, if everybody scored full marks on that 90%, that 10% is the decider, effectively, at that point. We're trying to move away from that. And one of the ways that we're doing that is by the inclusion of social value. Now, the best way to describe social value is the part where somebody says, tell me about all the stuff that your business does or can do that I haven't already asked you about. So this is not, can you do this particular job or this bid? This is more, what are you doing in your local communities? Is your business within sort of the area of this local authority? Is there going to be a direct benefit to the community? Are you employing apprentices? Are you employing ex-service men and women? Are you employing ex-offenders? Are you sponsoring the local football team? Are you working with schools to provide career days and work experience opportunities for kids? All those things contribute to social value, and more local authorities, central government, bidding authorities, anybody in a public sector contract should be asking you, as part of the scoring mechanism, what social value can you provide as part of this contract? Sometimes they might be a little bit more direct and say, can you employ so many apprentices under this contract or whatever? But again, we try and encourage bidding authorities to be more open-minded with how they're interpreting social value. So it's less for those who are familiar with housing, a Section 106 order, which is effectively build 5 houses, but also build as a school on the side, sort of thing. We want this to be much more reflective of what businesses can offer as part of simply sort of existing, the social impact that they have. And please, because I've seen some large businesses do this, if you are putting together your social value, the amount you pay in tax does not count as social value. That is something you are required to do.
I can't help but admire them for trying.
I pay £300,000 a year for my business, and I should blimmin' well get that social value.
That's not social value. It's the stuff that you're not being told to do, but you do because you know it's the right thing to do, or because you're giving opportunities to people that need it.
Well, with a good accountant, surely paying tax is optional.
All businesses do this all the time. The social value, not the good accountant.
Yeah. So
I can see that they don't figure it out.
I can see that Guy had to bring Brackley Town in somewhere, didn't he? So social value, just to clarify this, Dan, social value, does that include sponsoring a local football team?
It can do.
There we
go.
I
think most of the time they're looking for things like apprenticeships and that sort of thing. But yeah, 100% definitely include it.
Yeah, if you can draw a line to somebody in the local community benefits from the presence of you in the community, then you can tie it in. I think another one I know a lot of people do is a lot of people have an informal charity arm. It won't be an official charity. It will just be a brand, basically. They pump some money into and spend it on things in the local area. That kind of activity works well in these circumstances, because it's such a... Would you say that it's better to have something on the books that doesn't require people to kind of be persuaded that it counts? You were saying there about some local councils need them. At the moment, do you think it's best to have something that's quite directly we do like the M3 Job Club we support?
Yeah. Definitely. There's multiple ways of doing this. You can do the sort of on the books way of doing it, which is, yes, we have this many apprentices. We employ this many people straight out of or from NEAT backgrounds, not in education, technical training, or whatever that acronym stands for. Those are definite things that local authorities and contracting authorities will be looking for. But then you also have those extra bits on top, which
it's a cherry on top.
Definitely look into those.
So you said, Dan, that traditionally it was like everybody scored 100% on everything, and then it came down to price. With the growth of this CSR, corporate social responsibility type elements coming in, do you have to be still pretty tight on price, and then of the people who are good on price, the CSR will be the influencer, or can you just drift a little bit if you've got a really strong CSR presence? Where would you say the line is at the moment?
So what we're trying to do is encourage that CSR part to be a bigger and bigger proportion of that overall system, because ultimately you just create, if price is making up the last 10%, you don't want a situation where CSR is only making up 1%, because that means that you can then only be 1% off in your pricing. So the bigger we can make that CSR section, the less price dependent it will become. What you can't do is you can't double your prices because of the local football team, for example. So there is a bit of common sense to be used in here. There's a little bit of a margin there. But hopefully it's the difference between doing a project at cost, or in some cases where we've seen large companies do this, where they do big projects at losses simply because then they get on the contract and everything else. And being able to say, actually, yeah, fine, we're a little bit more expensive, but we've got a much greater social impact value. And if you're competing against a big business who is not based in your local authority and you're based in your local authority, you should be nailing that social value section every day of the week compared to them, simply because the money that local authority is spending is staying in that local economy and it's supporting local people within it. It is not going off to the London Stock Exchange at some point.
Indeed. So we're going to go into our next section now. So just remind, we've got some corkers of questions here, but still keep putting them in.
Fantastic. Yes, please do keep passing them over. And actually, just while we move on to the next session, I would ask this, just thinking about the webinars over the rest of the year, Nikki, we've got the themes. We want, one of the big ones is going to be around winning more work. Would anybody, given the emphasis that Dan has put on CSR, would anybody be interested either in a webinar or perhaps one of the shows that Nikki does, the broadcast, talking about the kinds of things that we can do, sort of broadening the horizon on CSR? If anybody's interested, just pop a 7 in the chat for me, just so we can get a bit of a feel for the level of interest. I like the number 7.
I'm not sure why 7.
It's lucky. It's lucky number 7.
Okay.
But yes, so that said, back to the
let's
flow.
crack on. Right, 4th section. So this is really key. So, have a sip of your tea, coffee. You need to wake up for this section, because this is what are the common mistakes that people make. So this is an opportunity for you to learn from this out there watching, so that you don't make these same mistakes. What are the key mistakes that people make?
So I think the biggest one would be expecting the public sector to work quite on the same time scales as the private sector does.
Any time scales?
It is slow. It is designed to be slow from day one. That's the way government works. We are trying to speed them up with various things, but there is process in place, and when you're spending public money, there is a bit more process to go through than normal. So don't bid for contracts thinking that you're going to get a response within the next day or two and find out whether or not you've won it within the next week. Rarely does that happen. So take your time with these things. That's why we encourage you to look at those early notices on things like Contracts Finder and start that stopwatch as soon as you can to make sure that you can get your bid in place and that these things are coming down a pipeline in the future. So these aren't necessarily quick fixes all the time, and generally the bigger the contract or the closer to central government you go, generally speaking, the longer that process is going to take. If you are looking for something a bit quicker, your local authority is probably in a better place compared to going to a national government department, for example. So just breathe, make a cup of tea. This is going to take a little bit of time to do it.
A good example that I've got with the business that I work with is they bid for a specific framework contract, and the framework that they're applying for originally was supposed to be applying for March 21. We're hoping it's going to be open March 22. It keeps getting delayed. Very frustrating. If you're expecting, if you missed out on the last framework and you're waiting for the next framework to open, it can be very, very frustrating.
Yeah. I guess that's one of the reasons those DPS are perhaps a better place to start, Dan, because you don't have that constant holding of breath.
Yeah. And so just on the back of that, if you're talking to somebody and they ever give you a season, it's a time when something will come out, just clarify what year. Because we have definitely had it before where winter runs through to April. Spring is in February. So just try and pin them down to a range of months and possibly a year, because that is a civil service tactic that is the bane of my life personally. There we are. That's a slightly different topic that we're getting into.
No, but good tip. You need clarity, and don't be surprised that then they change it. Okay, so yeah, this is a good one that we were talking about before. You know, if you think, oh, something's a bit difficult, not a good idea to ignore it, is it?
No. Don't leave it empty. Don't think, oh, this doesn't apply to me, and just put not applicable in the box. Explain why it's not applicable to you, and explain why it doesn't apply to you. There have been many bids, and if we go back to that point structure again, where even if you are asked the most ridiculous question on behalf of this bidding process, and it really doesn't apply, and you're wondering why on earth they're asking that, explain to them politely why this doesn't apply. Because if you leave that blank, or if you put not applicable, then you will score very minimal points in that section, even though you are absolutely right in what you're saying. So you kind of have to convince them that actually, no, I don't need to be answering this, and this is why. It's either not relevant to your business, it's just not something that applies, or whatever. But make sure you fill in the form. That's the number one rule. The second you leave a section blank, you're missing points, you're dropping points. And in a world where a lot of sections you're expected to score 100% on, you need those points. So don't think that, oh, I can just skip through this bit. It doesn't apply to you, that section.
Indeed. So we're going back to pricing again now to do a bit more detail on that. So what sort of common mistakes that people make with the pricing?
I think the most common mistake is that because of the pressure that can come on pricing as well, is that you can often put your price way too low. So don't bid yourself low for a contract that you're not looking forward to winning. Because exactly. You don't want to force yourself to go through all this work, all that process, and then find out that actually you were so desperate to win it that you put your price way too low, and now it's not worth the paper that it's written on, and you're doing a great service for the public sector, but you're not making any money whatsoever out of it because
or even worse, losing money. Crazy.
Yes. Yeah.
Keep an eye on that salesman. They get excited sometimes.
It's not, in our view, it's not worth it. You shouldn't be forced to do contracts that sort of return. We have seen it where businesses will do that exactly just to get their foot in the door. There may well be business coaches out there that say this is a tactic to getting your foot in the door, winning that first contract, and then the next ones you can go through on. There are little things you can do with pricing, different caveats within clauses, which I'm sure Nikki will be able to talk to us about a little bit. But generally speaking, don't bid low to open the door, because whilst that can help, realistically, you could be in this framework for years, and you could be supplying that. If you're not careful, you could be supplying at the price for years and not enjoying what you're doing fundamentally, and it just doesn't work out.
Absolutely.
So make sure that there's always a reason why you're going in at that price.
Yeah. So this is a tip for in your contracts, making sure you're very, very stringent on, get good advice on writing those contracts, because, make sure that your base, what I've seen in some ones that have applied for big frameworks and big contracts, they are price competitive, and their base product is very price competitive, but it's very clear as soon as it's a different color, a slightly different finish, whatever else it is, extra costs are put on. So they do end up getting a reasonable amount of price, or some sort of mechanism for, base materials. If the global aluminium rate goes up or whatever, to try to, wherever you possible, try and caveat these things so that you're not having to supply something with no margin or a loss. Indeed.
Nikki, shall we summarize now?
Oh, let's just say so much. Summarize. Right. Okay. Number 1. Go to the source, go to contract finder, go to the local authorities. Do not pay. Number 1. Second one, how should you select your first one? Carefully, very carefully. Don't do a scattergun approach. Be very selective. Think of the ones that you've got most chance on, and do a very thoughtful bid, and go for those. Thirdly, best tips to succeed: preparation. Prepare, don't wing it. Get all your legal documents in a row, make sure they're all together, and actually it's a good idea having that for whatever you're doing, having a proper library of all those documents, because that's useful for succession planning, sales of your business, anything. So have those things all ready and make sure they're all up to date, and get your pricing right. And then common mistakes. So we've talked about pricing. We've talked about be careful with the timelines. So don't go recruiting a load of people to deliver this, because it might end up being delayed by a year. So, obviously you need access to be able to deliver it, but don't go and put your money on the line for it as yet. Do not, it's not about the first person that finishes their exam paper in this. You need to make sure you fill it, everything out, carefully look through, and don't leave anything blank. Even if you think it doesn't apply to you, at least put in why you don't think it applies to you. Don't assume anything, and don't assume that it's not worth it. Don't be put off just because you might fail on the first go. Take that as a learning experience. Hopefully you will get that feedback form, and make sure you do learn from that feedback form. Is that a summary?
I think it's a perfect summary. Yes, very well done, Nikki. Yeah,
I was paying attention.
Do you want to round us off officially, and then we shall move into Q&A?
So thank you. We are going to do Q&A, so don't click off your share if you want to stay on to listen to the answers to your questions. But thank you very much to Dan. Been absolutely fabulous. You can connect to Dan on LinkedIn, or go directly to FSB if you've got any questions, you want to feedback things, experiences that you've had. The FSB are always looking for real life experiences of problems that a SME are having in the marketplace, and they are there. That's what they're there for, to support us and represent us. So anyway, thank you very much, Dan. It's been fabulous.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
And I will have to try. I'll see if I can get Craig to find you an FSB mug, because you've been such a brilliant person. And as always, thank you to Pete. Thank you very much. And to keeping us on track as always, because otherwise I will go over time. And just a reminder, we will have another of our lovely webinars in April, subject to be determined, but I'm suspecting it is going to be on CSR, because I see we've already had some positive feedback on that. And don't forget, we also have our LinkedIn Lives every Friday. And the next one, this one is for finance for non-finance managers, to talk you through all the jargon, especially if you are a non-finance manager, or if you are a finance manager. It's to open your eyes to understand that the non-finance managers don't have a clue what you're talking about, to help you work out how to speak to the non-finance managers. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. So we're going into our additional Q&A. Pete,
yes, we are. Let's go.
after.
Right. Bunch of questions. Dan. Few questions that we didn't necessarily touch on when it came to the scoring mechanism. Some things out there that people think. Does it make a difference to being selected, whether you are a company, a limited company, rather than a partnership or a sole trader?
Generally, no. There will be individual contracts where it just might naturally be a bit more advantageous. It might help for insurance purposes, for example, to be a limited company compared to a sole trader. Obviously, if part of the contract is asking how many apprentices that you've got and you're a sole trader, it's going to be difficult to establish that one. But generally, there are no hard and fast rules that say thou must be a limited company or thou must be a sole trader or flexi, whatever. No, is the answer. That if you can do the work and you've got a history of doing that and you can meet all those other requirements, then just because you're a limited company shouldn't really make a difference.
Fantastic. Following on from that similar question, does it make a difference if you are an established company or a startup?
That's a good question, actually. So one of the things that government are always looking for, and this kind of comes back to the construction side of things, is that they want to see that you've got a reasonable turnover in the private sector. Because what the public sector doesn't want to do is the public sector doesn't want to become 100% of your market by awarding you one contract. Because if you go under at that point, they're then left without anything else to do, or if the contract doesn't come off, then you go under because you haven't got any more money coming in because you've gone entirely private sector at that point. So I'd say that if you have that sort of long history of being involved with the private sector, and then you're turning your head around to have a look at the public sector, it definitely helps because you can demonstrate that actually you've got a big client book, you've got a high level of turnover. This public sector contract is in addition to what you're already doing. It's a top up rather than being your main business. Equally, you can say that this is actually to push us to the next level and try and push the business on to that next phase, which is perfectly fine because you've established that your business works. It's what you're doing. You've been delivering this product forever and a day, and all you do now is deliver it in the public sector. If you're a startup, there's definitely contracting opportunities out there for you. It can mean that you have to go at a slightly lower financial level, and for all the reasons that we've just explained. But equally, if you're a startup and you're a bit more innovative, whether it's a product or a service, and you can show that actually, okay, this is a startup, but this is something the government should be buying and investing in because there's no one else doing this, then they will also take a look at you. So don't think that just because you're a startup, you need to go away to the private sector for a couple of years and build that client book. If your product's good enough, you will get a look in. But if your product or your service is relatively common, let's say you're a window fitter, for example, someone's got to put windows in a building when one gets unfortunately smashed in a local government office or whatever, they are going to want to see that actually, yeah, you've done this before and this isn't your first time fitting windows. Yeah.
Not a way to switch careers. Okay, thank you for that. And then last one in this vein of what makes a difference. We know that your tax record doesn't play in your favor just because you pay taxes. But let's say you used an accountant that wasn't up to the standards of Gorringe, and perhaps you had a few black marks against you. Can your tax record be held against you in these things?
Yes, it can. But also if you can demonstrate that there are very good reasons for this and it's been absolved or whatever. But it is a bit of an uphill battle if you've got those things against your current business as well.
So is that if you've done something wrong, or is it for, like, there are hundreds of thousands of business out there that are on TTPs at the moment. So are you talking about if you've done something naughty, or if you have got some sort of agreed plan?
No, I'm talking about if you've done something naughty.
Naughty, right. It's good to know for people, which obviously would be zero of our clients.
Yes, well, I should hope so, Nick.
Yes.
But yeah. If you've done something naughty, that is going to show up.
Yes.
But it's quite common for businesses to have those TTVs and different mechanisms in place, especially given the last couple of years that we've currently had as well, and how difficult it's been for businesses to basically survive. So if you are still going in and it has been a difficult couple of years, don't think that this then excludes you from billing for those contracts.
This is true. Okay, thank you. Someone's asked, small businesses, as you know, you work at the FSB, cash flow, almost more than profit, is the thing that kills businesses. So if you are a small business going in, how quickly are you likely to get paid? Should you win a contract, you deliver the service, you deliver the goods, what can you think in terms of cash flow?
So this is a massive area for FSB. We want you to get paid as quickly as possible, less than 5 days, ideally. And we do push for it. There's the prompt payment code in place. We've had 4 payers, so people who are paying in excess of 60, 90 days, sometimes even up to 200 days. We've had them excluded from being able to bid for government sector contracts. So at the moment, the current rule is that it's actually changing in April. But it used to be that if you don't pay 95% of your invoices within 60 days, you cannot bid directly to a government contract. And that's there to effectively stop the big boys, those that have to publish their data, their payment data in government websites. It's to stop them taking on those government contracts and then refusing to pay their supply chain. So if you don't pay your supply chain on time, you're not winning any more government work. There are a few exceptions where there really is only one provider. For example, if you're building I've got to be careful what I say because I don't want to say any one company, but there's very few companies that can build warships, for example. SMEs aren't likely to deliver that. So if they're paying late and you still need a warship, then you're going to have to use them regardless.
Suck it up.
So
Yeah.
there are a few exceptions.
And
Nothing-
just to put that, don't let that be put off in case you're thinking, oh my God, I'm going to win this contract, but then I'm not sure how to fund it. If you get a government contract or other public sector contract, they are good as gold for getting trade finance or invoice financing and different things like that. So don't be put off on the cash flow thing. There's usually a way around it if you've done it properly.
Yeah, there's kind of two schools to this. If you're working directly with a local authority, with a contracting authority, payment terms tend to be quite good because you're dealing direct at that level and you're in there. Most times you're talking less than 30 days. We still want that to be closer to more like 5 days. But you're talking around 30 days. If you're in the supply chains of businesses, if you're in public sector supply chains, then by law, those payment terms that the tier 1 providers on shouldn't be any worse as they go down the supply chain. Again, it's that word should. But we're working hard to try and reduce those payment terms coming down. So as I said, we've got the exclusion in there. And if you want to check, if you're in a supply chain and you want to check how quickly your government pays, you can go to the duty to report website. You can Google, so you can search for the company that you're doing business with and it will pull up their payment record. You can also go to the Good Business Pays campaign and they do exactly the same thing. It's reskinned site, so it's a bit easy to read. But it will tell you if I am doing a job with Bob Jones Big Company Limited, FTSE 100, I can go on their website, put their name in, and it will tell me how quickly that they pay and all their payments. So you can work that out. Yeah. We're using the prompt payment code, which has just changed or is changing to make sure that SMEs, 95% of your SMEs should be paid within 30 days. And we're hopeful to see that sort of reflected in those exclusion clauses as well going forward. So really, if you're an SME, minimum standard payment terms we would ask for are 30 days. Prompt payments, which we think is very different from that. Prompt payment should be more in the region of about 5 days. It should be less than a week, ideally. It's one of our key topics at FSB. We get asked all the time by large businesses, can you send these opportunities out to your membership? Because we'd like to get some SMEs involved in this project. And our first question is, how quickly are you going to pay them? Because if it's anything more than 30 days, then it's a straight no, unless you can move on that. Because businesses shouldn't wait 100, 200 plus days to get paid. It's a big sore area for us.
Yeah, I think for all of us small business owners, although most of our clients are very good. Okay, that's the last question then now. So fantastic. Thank you so much for answering
Excellent.
all these questions, Dan. The last one was, if you wanted to find a consultant to help you in writing your bid, where would you recommend somebody looks? What should they look for? How much should they pay?
That is a good question. So normally payment relates to the size of the contract that you're trying to win.
Mhm.
A lot of contracts, a lot of professional bid writers will probably be SMEs themselves. It's people who have a long history of doing this.
Yeah.
They did it for their own previous businesses. They've retired and now they kind of do this on the side or whatever.
Mhm.
So don't be put off if this seems like a one-man band that's doing it. But ask to see examples of bids that they've written and that they've won. Ask to speak to the businesses that they've worked with. Get that face-to-face relationship going with them. If you Google professional bid writing services online, there are plenty of large companies that will take your money and give you a relatively standard bid. Please, please, please don't do that, because I can guarantee you there will almost certainly be other businesses that have paid exactly the same fee to exactly the same business and have probably got a very similar bid being put together. And don't be surprised if some bid writers will say, if you win, then you pay us. If you don't win, then you don't pay us. There's two schools of thought on that. You could think, well, I've got nothing to lose by doing this. But equally, I tend to think that a bid writer who says, actually, no, you are going to pay me for the service. But what tends to happen is that you decide the price level. And what they say is, I can pretty much guarantee that you will get 100% on all these other areas, because it is quite tick boxy. It's the language of government. But the big decider is going to be the price. So if you put in a ridiculously high price, then there's no way that that bid was ever going to win in the first place. So don't be put off by the different pricing structures in there. Try and work out what type of bid writer is going to work for you.
Okay. Yep, that's fantastic. I think that's good advice. Hopefully it's answered the question for everybody. And on that note, 2:15, we are done.
Super. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you again, Dan, and thank you, Pete. And thank you very much, everybody that has been watching. I hope that's useful. If you're watching it on the video, then please do feel free to contact any of us. We're all on LinkedIn. So please do contact us if you've got any questions. And thank you very much. So have a lovely afternoon, everybody.